The man who never blinked. I used to work night shifts at an old psychiatric hospital, one of those buildings with long, sterile hallways that never seemed to end. The kind of place where the fluorescent lights buzz just a little too loudly, and the silence in between is worse than any noise. There was a patient, an older man in his late 60s, whom the staff called Mr. Holloway. No one knew much about him. He had no listed family, no visitors, and according to his records, he had been there longer than most of the staff. His diagnosis was vague, something about a dissociative disorder, with periods of catatonia and what was referred to as prolonged staring episodes. The first time I met him, I was doing my rounds past his room. The door was slightly ajar, and when I glanced inside, he was sitting in his chair facing the wall. Not moving. Not blinking. Just staring. I called his name softly, but he didn't react. His chest barely moved with his breath. I stepped closer, and for reasons I can't explain, a cold dread crept up my spine. Then, without warning, he turned his head slow, deliberate. His eyes locked onto mine. I have never seen eyes like his. Completely unblinking, wide open, as if he hadn't closed them in days. There was something unnatural about them, not just the way they stared but the way they saw. Like he wasn't just looking at me, he was looking through me. I quickly excused myself and left. For the next few weeks, I noticed it happening again and again. Every time I passed his room, he was staring. Not at the wall anymore, at me. And each night, it seemed like he was a little closer to the door, just inching forward without ever being seen moving. I started dreading my rounds, walking faster when I neared his room. But the real horror began when I checked the security cameras. At around 2 a.m. one night, I reviewed the footage of my rounds. When the feed reached Mr. Holloway's room, my stomach dropped. He wasn't sitting. He was standing. Standing directly behind me in the dark as I walked past. But I swear when I had looked in his room, he had been sitting in his chair. He hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. And yet, there he was, watching me from behind. I didn't finish my shift that night. I told my supervisor I was sick and went home. The next evening, I came in early to speak to the doctor overseeing Mr. Holloway. I wanted to know more. His history, his condition, anything. But when I mentioned his name, the doctor frowned. "Mr. Holloway?" he said, flipping through his clipboard. "That can't be right. He passed away 3 weeks ago. Massive stroke in his sleep." I insisted I had just seen him. I had been checking his room every night. But the doctor shook his head and even showed me the paperwork confirming his death. So who had been staring at me? And worse, who had been standing behind me? The woman who spoke in reverse. Hospitals are unsettling places at night. Everything is too quiet, too still, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every small noise. The hum of fluorescent lights, the faint buzz of the security cameras, the occasional distant cough from a patient down the hall. I had worked night shifts in a psychiatric hospital for years, and I had seen plenty of unnerving things: patients in deep psychosis, people screaming at things that weren't there. But nothing prepared me for Elaine Parker. She arrived late one evening under emergency psychiatric care. The paramedics who brought her in wouldn't say much, just that she had been found wandering alone on the side of the highway, barefoot, staring at the sky. She had no ID, no relatives, no record of ever existing. At first she was just unresponsive. She wouldn't answer questions, wouldn't acknowledge anyone around her. Just sat on the edge of the hospital bed, hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. We thought it was catatonia. Maybe trauma. The doctors admitted her for observation, assuming she'd start talking once she felt safe. She didn't. She just sat there, not eating, not sleeping, not moving. The staff started calling her the statue because she never blinked, never twitched. The only time she ever reacted was if someone tried to touch her, then she'd just tilt her head slightly, almost like she was listening to something we couldn't hear. Then, on the third night, she started whispering. I was on duty when I first heard it. It was around 3 a.m., that cursed hour when everything in a hospital feels off. I was doing my rounds when I passed her room and heard something mumbling. At first, I thought she was just talking in her sleep. But when I stepped closer, I realized she was awake. Her lips barely moved, and the words coming from her mouth, they weren't right. They were backwards. It wasn't gibberish. It wasn't just random sounds. It was perfectly spoken sentences in reverse, as if someone had taken a recording and rewound it. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just listened. Then I heard my name. Natano J. Dean Woy. Jonathan. You need what? A shiver ran down my spine. The way she said it, slow, deliberate, it felt like she wasn't just saying my name. She was warning me. I backed out of the room and closed the door. I didn't mention it to anyone. I told myself I had misheard her, that my tired brain was playing tricks on me. But the next night it happened again. At exactly 3 a.m. she started whispering. Again backwards. And this time it wasn't just a few words, it was a full conversation. I couldn't understand it, but the rhythm, the pauses, the way she occasionally stopped to listen before responding, it was like she was talking to someone. Someone who wasn't there. That night I made a mistake. I recorded her. I had to know what she was saying. So I used my phone to capture a few minutes of her whispers. I sat in the break room, reversed the audio, and listened. The voice that played back wasn't hers. It was deeper, distorted, and the words chilled me to my core. You need to listen. It is coming. The man with no face. I looked up from my phone and nearly dropped it. Elaine was standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard her move, hadn't heard her door open. But she was just standing there, her wide, unblinking eyes locked on me. Her lips never moved, but somehow I knew she knew I had listened. I wanted to leave. I wanted to call for help. But I just sat there, frozen, heart pounding. Then she spoke. For the first time in perfect English. Jonathan, don't turn around. My breath caught in my throat. The hairs on my neck stood up. I could feel it, the thick, oppressive weight of something standing behind me. I should have listened to her. But I didn't. I turned around. There was nothing there. But the feeling remained. That horrible sensation of something watching me, breathing down my neck, waiting for me to see it. I grabbed my things and left the hospital early that night. When I came back the next evening, Elaine was gone. Not discharged. Gone. Her room was empty. The sheets on her bed were still perfectly in place. No one had seen her leave. No security footage showed her exiting the building. The only thing we found was my phone sitting on the desk in her room. The screen was still on, the audio recording still open. But when I pressed play, there was only one phrase over and over again. Behind you. I quit my job the next day. But sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I still hear whispers. Speaking in reverse. And I never ever turn around. The patient in room 6. Every psychiatric hospital has a room the staff avoids. Maybe it's superstition. Maybe it's just a coincidence. But in my hospital, it was room 6, a windowless, nondescript room at the end of the east hallway. It wasn't locked. It wasn't condemned. It was always assigned to a patient. But for some reason no one ever stayed there long. Patients were either transferred out suddenly or worse, they disappeared from the records entirely. I learned about room 6 my first week on night shifts. I was new, eager to prove myself, so I followed every rule. But there was one rule they never wrote down. One night as I was making my rounds, a senior nurse stopped me. If you hear anything from room 6, she said, ignore it, and never open the door. She wouldn't explain why. At first I thought it was just hospital gossip. A scary story to freak out the new guy. Then one night I heard it for myself. It was around 2:45 a.m., the dead hour when time stretches and the air feels heavier. I was alone in the east hallway checking vitals on the monitor when I felt it, a shift in the atmosphere. The hallway was silent, except for the soft hum of the hospital lights. But when I passed room 6, I felt something cold run through me. Then the knocking started. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I checked my clipboard. Room 6 was supposed to be empty. Another knock. Louder this time. I swallowed hard and leaned toward the door. My fingers hovered over the handle. Then I remembered what the nurse told me, never open the door. Instead, I crouched down and looked through the small glass observation window. A man was standing in the center of the room. He wasn't supposed to be there. His hospital gown was too clean, like he had just arrived. His arms hung stiffly at his sides, and his head was tilted at an unnatural angle, staring at the door. And then, without moving his lips, I heard him speak. Help me. The voice didn't come from inside the room. It came from right next to my ear. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. I turned to call for security, but when I looked back through the window, he was gone. The next morning, I checked the security footage. The cameras showed no one entering or leaving room 6 all night. The patient log still listed it as empty. I tried to tell myself I imagined it. That exhaustion had gotten the best of me. But then, 3 nights later, room 6 was assigned a new patient. A middle-aged man named Victor Hale, schizophrenic, nonviolent. He had been brought in after a psychotic break, found wandering the streets, muttering about someone standing behind him. I wasn't supposed to check on him. But at exactly 3 a.m. I heard it again. 3 slow knocks. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to keep walking. But I couldn't. I had to know. I checked the window. Victor was standing in the center of the room. Just like the man before him. Same arms at his sides. Same unnatural tilt of his head. His mouth wasn't moving. But I heard it anyway. Help me. This time I backed away immediately. I didn't run, didn't scream, I just turned and walked. I didn't sleep that morning. The next night Victor was gone. No transfer records. No discharge papers. His file was missing. I asked the receptionist about him. She frowned, confused. Who? She said. There was no patient named Victor Hale in the system. Room 6 was empty again. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not then. But after that I started avoiding room 6. Until 1 week later when I passed it during my rounds. I tried not to look. I tried to ignore it. But as I walked by, I felt that familiar chill. And then, from the other side of the door, 3 slow knocks. This time I didn't check the window. I didn't stop. I just kept walking. And I never worked night shifts again. Hospitals have patterns. Patients cycle in and out, shifts blend together, and the same small superstitions get passed down over time. For me, it was the 4th bed in Ward C. Our psych unit had a room with 4 beds, a common setup for long-term patients. But bed 4 was always empty. Not because we kept it that way. We tried to assign patients to it, but no one ever stayed. Some refused to sleep there. Others moved their mattresses onto the floor without explanation. A few lasted a night or 2 before demanding a transfer, sometimes in a full-blown panic attack. I assumed it was just superstition. This was a psych ward after all. Patients had delusions, hallucinations, anxieties. Maybe it was a rumor that had spread through the ward like an infection. But then one night I saw it for myself. It was 2:30 a.m., and the halls were silent except for the occasional beeping of a heart monitor. I was finishing my rounds, walking past room 7, when I noticed something off. The 4th bed wasn't empty anymore. I stopped. At first, I assumed a new patient had been assigned while I was busy. But when I stepped closer, something felt wrong. My stomach turned, and a pressure built in my chest like I had walked into a vacuum where the air was too thick, too heavy. Because the patient in bed 4 wasn't on my list. And worse, I recognized her. Her name was Lena Carter, and she had been a patient on our ward 2 years ago. She was young, maybe early 30s, with dark hair and a permanently anxious expression. She had been admitted for paranoid schizophrenia. But she wasn't like the other patients. Most heard voices, saw shadow figures, thought they were someone else. But Lena's fear was specific. Fixated. She would spend hours lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, her lips trembling as she whispered, "It watches. It watches. It never blinks." One night, she vanished from the hospital. Security footage showed her lying in bed 4, perfectly still until 2:45 a.m. Then without warning she sat up. Her head snapped toward the ceiling, her pupils blown wide, mouth slightly open. She stared directly into the security camera. Then without making a sound she got up and walked out of the room. The problem? She never made it to the hallway. 1 second she was walking toward the door, the next she was gone. No alarms. No exit footage. No trace of her anywhere in the hospital. Her case was closed as a patient elopement, hospital speak for, "We lost her and don't know how." And yet here she was, lying in bed 4, motionless, the blanket pulled neatly over her. I felt frozen in place. My mind scrambled for an explanation. A mix-up? A hallucination? Was I just sleep-deprived? Then I saw her eyes open. They snapped open all at once, too fast, too unnatural. Her pupils were blown wide, like a corpse that had been dead for days. But she didn't look at me. She was staring past me, straight at the ceiling. And then she whispered, "It's still watching." Something moved. I didn't see it, not at first. I felt it. A shifting in the air, a creaking noise from above. A sharp, sudden chill washed over me, and for the first time in my life, I felt something I can only describe as primal dread. I didn't want to look up. Every nerve in my body screamed at me not to look up. I took a step back, my breath coming fast and shallow. I turned toward the nurse's station, heart hammering so hard I felt lightheaded. But when I looked back, the bed was empty again. The sheets were still perfectly smooth, undisturbed. Like no one had ever been there. The next morning I checked the overnight camera feed. And just like with Lena's case 2 years ago, there was nothing. No movement. No one in the bed. But at exactly 2:45 a.m. the camera glitched. For 3 seconds the screen was filled with static. And then, in a single frame, something appeared. Not Lena. Not a patient. Something stretched across the ceiling, long, bony limbs bent at unnatural angles. Something with too many joints. Something with empty, hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. Something that was watching. The glitch ended. The footage resumed. Bed 4 was empty. After that, I stopped trying to explain it. Patients still refused to sleep there. They still woke up screaming when they did. And at 2:45 a.m. the cameras still glitched. I never looked up after that. And I never ever stood near bed 4 at night.